It was early morning in the quiet suburban town of Maple Grove, the kind of place where white picket fences lined the streets and the lawns were meticulously manicured. The sun had just started to rise, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood, when a lone jogger appeared on the pavement. Darren Lewis, a 45-year-old black man, was on his usual morning run. Dressed in sleek running gear, his muscular legs moved rhythmically as he ran. His wrist glinted in the sunlight, where a shiny Rolex was strapped, a prized possession that he had worked hard to afford. To Darren, the Rolex was more than just a luxury item. It was a symbol of perseverance, success, and the sacrifices he had made to climb the ladder in his career. He jogged through the familiar streets, nodding politely to neighbors he passed along the way. But as he approached the end of one block, something felt off. Parked near the curb was a police cruiser, and Darren could feel the officer inside watching him intently. He had lived in Maple Grove for 5 years and ran this route almost every day, but today felt different. The engine of the cruiser roared to life, and the vehicle slowly began to follow Darren. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, focusing on his breathing and pace. But then, the car pulled up alongside him, and the officer stepped out. "Hey, you!" the officer called. Darren slowed his pace and removed his earbuds, turning to face the officer. The man, a white police officer in his early 30s, walked toward him with one hand resting on his belt. His eyes were fixed on Darren's wrist. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darren asked, his voice calm but cautious. The officer's gaze never left the watch. "That's a nice Rolex you're wearing. Mind telling me where you got it?" Darren's stomach dropped as his heart quickened. He knew exactly where this was headed. He had seen it play out countless times in the news, in viral videos. A black man, dressed well, living in a nice neighborhood, being questioned because he didn't fit the profile. Darren looked down at his watch and back up at the officer, his expression neutral, though inside he felt a familiar frustration bubbling. "I bought it," Darren said simply. The officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "That's not exactly a cheap watch. How do I know you didn't steal it? People like you don't usually wear that kind of thing." There it was. The assumption. The prejudice. Darren could feel the tension building in his chest. People like him? Darren had worked his whole life to be more than just a stereotype. He was a successful businessman, a homeowner, a father, and a husband. But none of that mattered to this officer. To him, Darren was just another black man in a predominantly white neighborhood with something expensive that didn't belong. "I didn't steal anything," Darren replied, keeping his voice even. "This watch was purchased with money I earned. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish my run." The officer stepped closer, blocking Darren's path. "I'm going to need to see some ID. You're acting suspicious, and I need to verify that watch isn't stolen." Darren clenched his fists at his sides. Suspicious? He wasn't doing anything other than jogging, something he did every morning. How had that become suspicious? "I don't carry my wallet when I go running," Darren explained, his patience thinning, "but I live right down the street. If you want, I can take you to my house, and I'll show you my ID." The officer shook his head. "No need for that. Just stay right here." He reached for his radio, ready to escalate the situation. Darren knew this could go one of two ways. He could refuse, stand his ground, and risk this encounter turning into something far worse. Or he could try to de-escalate it, even though it was deeply unfair that he had to. Darren took a deep breath and raised his hands slightly, showing he wasn't a threat. "Officer," Darren said slowly, "I'm a resident of this neighborhood. I'm not a criminal. I'm just out for a jog, like I do every day. There's no need for this to go any further." The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning Darren's face. The doubt and suspicion in his gaze were unmistakable, but something held him back from making a move before the tension could thicken. A voice called out from nearby. "Darren, everything all right over there?" Darren turned to see Mrs. Miller, an elderly white woman who lived 2 houses down, standing on her porch. She squinted at the unfolding scene, clearly concerned. Darren nodded in her direction. "I'm fine, Mrs. Miller. Just a misunderstanding." The officer glanced between Darren and Mrs. Miller, his expression shifting from one of suspicion to confusion. Mrs. Miller shuffled closer, leaning on her walker as she approached the sidewalk. "Officer, this is Darren Lewis. He's been my neighbor for years. If you're questioning him, I can assure you he's a good man." The officer looked momentarily flustered. His grip on his belt loosened, and he cleared his throat. "We've had reports of some thefts in the area, ma'am. I'm just doing my job, following up on a suspicious situation." Mrs. Miller shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "I understand that, officer, but you've made a mistake. Darren lives here. There's nothing suspicious about him. We know him, and he's a part of our community." The officer's face flushed, and he looked back at Darren, the suspicion draining from his posture. "I apologize, Mr. Lewis. I was just being cautious, given the circumstances." Darren looked at the officer, his mind racing with a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. A part of him wanted to demand more than just a hollow apology. But another part of him, the part that knew change came through dialogue and understanding, decided to take a different path. "We all make mistakes," Darren said after a long pause. "What's important is that we learn from them." The officer nodded, the weight of the moment settling between them. "I'll keep that in mind. I'm sorry for the trouble." As the officer returned to his car, Mrs. Miller gave Darren a gentle pat on the shoulder before heading back to her porch. The street was quiet again, but the air felt different now, less charged but heavy with reflection. Darren continued his jog, though his thoughts were far from the run now. He had every right to be angry, to feel hurt and resentful. But instead, he chose something harder, something his father had always told him was the key to real change: forgiveness. It wasn't easy to forgive, especially when the prejudice seemed so deeply ingrained in the very fabric of society. But if there was to be progress, if the barriers between people were to be broken down, then forgiveness had to play a role. Not just forgiveness for others, but forgiveness for the fear and ignorance that often clouded their judgment. Darren couldn't change the officer's initial assumptions, but he could control how he responded to them. And in that response, he hoped to plant a seed of growth. As Darren reached the end of the street, he glanced down at his Rolex, the hands ticking steadily forward. Time moved on, and so too could people. One small act of kindness, one conversation, one jog at a time. One step forward, always.